The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
Young people have been saying for years, I don't like politicians, they don't speak for me, they don't speak to me, and they're all the same, and it doesn't make a difference whether I vote or not.
Then, later tonight.
I think it's worrying that, we've just kind of accepted that this is the trade-off for having all these cars around, that people are naturally going to die when it doesn't have to be this way.
Many people have sought to understand why young people don't turn out to vote in bigger numbers. Here's a scary thought. What if it's because they don't really believe in democracy? New research suggests that might be closer to the truth than most of us would care to admit, and points to a rising interest in authoritarianism among some young people. Here to help us understand what's going on, let's welcome, in London, England, former Deputy Head of Policy at number 10 Downing Street, Will Tanner, who's now Director of the UK think tank Onward. In Oxford, UK, Yasha Monk, Professor at Johns Hopkins University and author of The Great Experiment, Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. In Montreal, Quebec, Dietlin Stolle, Professor of Political Science at McGill University and former Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. And here in our studio, Samantha Rush, Executive Director of the youth-led nonprofit group Apathy is Boring. Okay, great to have everybody on the program today, and I want to start by just sharing some of the numbers that come out of Will Tanner's recent report out of the United Kingdom. More than a quarter of 18 to 34-year-olds in the UK think democracy is a bad way of governing the country. That is 3 times higher than the share of those over age 55. 61% agree that, quote, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections would be a good way of governing this country. That number's doubled since 1999. 46% agree that, quote, having the army rule would be a good way of governing the country. That's a 5-fold increase since 1999. Here's Canadian youth views on democracy from those age 18 to 29. Only 39% in that age category strongly agree with the statement, democracy may have its problems, but it's better than any other form of government. That compares to 74% of those 60 and over. 49%, half of young people surveyed, are neutral on the question. 21% of young Canadians agree that it doesn't matter whether a government is democratic or non-democratic. 12% agree that under some circumstances, an authoritarian government may be preferable to a democratic one. That is twice the proportion of those over age 60 who would say this. And I guess we should note, in Canada, these numbers have remained relatively stable over the past few years when compared to other countries. That may suggest less of a trend towards more anti-democratic views among youth. One more graphic here. In the United States, their views on democracy among youth, age 18 to 29. 52%, roughly half of young Americans consider their democracy to be in trouble or failing. 13% of them don't know whether it's important that America is a democracy. 7% say either not very or not important at all. Those are the gory details. Yasha, you first. How worried are you about all this?
Well, I'm very concerned. My colleague Roberto Fora and I looked at very similar data 7 or 8 years ago to make the case that democracy in countries like the United States could come to be in trouble. This was at a time when people assumed that it was kind of strange and kooky to talk about potential threats to American democracy. What I learned in graduate school was that democratic institutions in rich countries that had had democratic elections for a very long time were completely certain. And it turned out to be a very good lead indicator, because a couple of years later, we got the election of Donald Trump, his attacks on the democratic system, and ultimately the assault on the Capitol on the 6th of January 2021. So what we're seeing here is asking some of those same questions again 5 or 6 years later. Things have actually gotten worse than they were at that point. And I think that just shows us the extent to which young people believe that the system is not delivering for them, are skeptical about the extent to which things are working for them and the system is going to deliver for them in the future. And that is as bright a warning sign as it was when we looked at that data originally a number of years ago.
Will Tanner, what do the numbers say to you?
Well, I too am deeply concerned. And I think what's interesting about this data and this report in particular is the extent to which, whereas previously we thought that the threat to democracy might be geographic in the sense that it was particular parts of the country. You might think of the Rust Belt in America, you might think of the Red Wall in the UK, where voters are particularly disenfranchised or feel disenchanted with the status quo in terms of the government of the country. We saw that with Brexit, we saw that to some degree with Donald Trump. Actually, this data suggests that the problem may be generational, that there is a number of age cohorts, particularly the 18 to 35-year-old cohort, who have grown up in a period where actually democracy was not under threat internationally. There was not a kind of big battle for democracy versus other forms of government around the world, and authoritarianism in particular, where democracy perhaps hasn't delivered for them, as Yasha says, and they have actually not really been sold on the benefits of democracy. And I think the long run effects of that in terms of the health of our democracies in the long term is profoundly worrying, actually. It could lead to a return for authoritarian forms of government. And I would say that that could happen on the left or the right. I'm not sure this is specifically a right-wing versus left-wing threat. I think it could happen across the political spectrum.
Professor Stoller, let me put the accent on Canada as I bring you into the conversation. We like to think in Canada that we are enjoying one of the saner democracies in this world. And I wonder whether you think we are somehow able to avoid much of the numbers that we have presented so far.
I thought so too. In fact, I was kind of skeptical when Yasha came out with his report a few years ago. No offense, Yasha. And we thought that young people really participate, for example, very differently in politics. And a lot of measures don't capture that. So we need to look at this very differently. So we also thought that maybe when we also measure the support for democracy, we cannot ask the normal survey questions about an abstract concept. And so we actually established some survey questions that dig more into what really makes democracy work. So, for example, we ask whether it's okay if a political leader takes away the checks from the executive, for example, in terms of media control or parliamentary contributions and judiciary limitations. And we thought that young people would not agree with this. We also thought that young people would not agree with some freedoms that can be removed. And what we found in our research, including in experiments, is that young people in particular are more laissez-faire about these issues and don't care as much when undemocratic politicians act. And that is worrisome to us. And it also happens in Canada as well as in the US. And we also see a similar trend in European countries.
Sam, I have purposely left you for the end so that you could hear what everybody else had to say first. And also because I presume you're in the age demographic that we are talking about here. And I want you to tell somebody who's of my generation why I ought not to be utterly mortified at these numbers.
I mean, I think we should all be utterly mortified by these numbers. I don't think that that's something that young people or different generational cohorts, should feel differently about. I think what we're seeing here is, one, I think youth can be a leading indicator in a lot of ways. When you have young people who are very concerned about their financial futures, very concerned by the idea that their government isn't working for them, and we have known that they felt that way for a long time. The research that we do into barriers to why people don't vote or participate in elections, for example, young people have been saying for years, I don't like politicians, they don't speak for me, they don't speak to me, and they're all the same, and it doesn't make a difference whether I vote or not.
Older people think that too.
Yes.
But they don't question democracy as a result of it. They question the politicians in question.
I think that the outcomes of that over time have built these narratives around, especially when you add into the mix really urgent problems that we're facing that are time-bound. So climate change, for example, young people feel very strongly that we need to act urgently and now. And we even have international bodies saying now that the governments of Western democracies are like sleepwalking towards climate disaster. And the stress of that young people feel. I think they're looking for decisive action on these issues, and I don't think they feel their governments are responding quickly enough in the way that they would like them to.
Yasha Monk, you're around young people all the time, given your perch at Johns Hopkins. Do you think young people don't understand what democracy actually is?
No, I think they understand the basics of the democratic system. At least my students do. I make sure of that. I do think, though, that part of this is something that Steve, you and I, as people who are in the media, should be somewhat self-critical about, because I think sometimes we are capable of focusing so much on the negative aspects of our society, so much on the things that aren't working, that we forget about some of the things that are working. Now, look, it's natural to be angry about the injustices in our society. It's natural to be angry about living standards not going up. It's natural to focus on those negative aspects. But I think when the narrative so exclusively comes to focus on those downsides, and we're not capable of actually expressing in a clear way what the values of our political system are, why it is so important to have a political system that has both collective self-determination and individual freedom, and how much better people have it in Britain, in Canada, in the United States, than in so many countries in the world that are led by authoritarian leaders who are not any better, by the way, at dealing with challenges like climate change, but who are much better at repressing their populations, at jailing people for what they're saying, at starting wars like we've seen Russia do in Ukraine recently. Then we shouldn't be surprised that people don't realize the upsides of their system. And what I find in general is that when you have democratic institutions, it's easy to start taking them for granted. You don't credit them for any of the good things they do, but you blame them for all of the bad things in your society. Once you start losing them, or when you don't have them, as we see the brave young people, men and many women in Iran standing up for these rights at the moment, then you really want those back. But of course, at that time, it is incredibly difficult to win those freedoms. So I'm optimistic about people fighting for freedom and for democracy in the long run, but I hope that they start doing that before it becomes far too hard.
Well, let me just ask Will the direct question. Do you think democracy has served, let's say you're 30 years old, has democracy well served 30-year-olds and younger over the past 3 decades?
No, I don't think so. And I think, especially in the country that I'm in, the UK, we have had a political system that has served older generations much better than younger generations. If you're in your 20s or 30s here in the UK, you are unlikely to be able to afford to buy a home in the same way that previous generations would have expected to. You are likely to be delaying the point at which you start a family because of financial costs. You're likely to be burdened, if you've been to university, you're burdened with a marginal tax rate, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, of 51%, higher than even people on £150,000 a year. So young people, I think, today rightly feel pretty peeved about the democratic system and the extent to which it's served them. And I do worry that increasingly young people are turning to more anti-democratic means in order to get their voice heard. So in the UK, for example, only a few weeks ago, we had a number of young people glue themselves to the Speaker's chair in the House of Commons in order to protest around climate change. Now, that's a very worthy cause, but that act is the very definition of an anti-democratic act. They were quite literally saying, Parliament is not serving us. We need, in this case, a People's Assembly instead. So the natural consequence of some of this disenchantment, I think, is a movement away from our democratic institutions. And I think politicians of all sides have, unfortunately, participated in a trashing of our institutions in this country, whether that's the rule of law, whether that's things like the Office for Budget Responsibility and fiscal discipline in this country, and that has moved young people away from democracy and opened the door to more authoritarian or anti-democratic forms of participation.
But Dietland, here's the part of the equation that I don't understand, which is your students, all of your students, they spend their formative teenage years essentially trying to defy authority, namely their parents. And yet we hear now in these surveys that if democracy is not working for them, they're prepared to take a step towards authoritarianism, which you'd think would be the exact opposite of what they'd want to do because they've been chafing against it for all of their life so far. Can you explain how that makes any sense?
Yeah, first of all, I think we should also maybe make a distinction. We cannot just talk about all young people. I mean, I think for some people the system has worked, but and students and their education has, of course, helped them to see some advantages of the democratic system. But I think what happens is that when young people don't see their goals and their political goals, climate change or immigration or whatever the issue is from all political sides, don't see it addressed and don't see their own worries addressed in the political system, don't see a political party that reaches out to them. That's when a leader that potentially is unifying, that is also overcoming the divisions in our society, the polarization in our society, and that maybe is a unifying symbol and that is forging ahead with some interesting ideas that they subscribe to, I think that leader then sounds attractive. And that doesn't necessarily mean that these young people take all of the disadvantages of an authoritarian society as well, or that they want to support that as well. But the idea of a strong leader that can overcome these divisions, that's, I think, what's interesting to young people.
Well, okay, Sam, walk us through this, because I've heard you talk about something called the survival instinct way of thinking, which you think young people are engaged in, and therefore leads them towards flirting with authoritarianism. What is that?
So I think similar to what Will said, which I think is a really important point, I think it's the case in the UK that a lot of young people, for example, can't afford a home, but it's the case in Canada here too, and has been for a while, especially in our major cities. And so you have people's basic needs in a sense. They have expectations about sort of the milestones of their lives and how that's going to go, and then the world sort of changes, the context changes, and those expectations aren't met. So there's a degree of stress of, am I going to be able to afford to have children? I hear young people talk about this all the time. Can I afford a kid? What about clean air and water and all of these things? And so this climate anxiety is a thing that people are talking about now. So there's this mental health burden to a lot of these things. And I agree that it impacts different youth to different degrees. But what happens when you have this stress or you have, mental health anxiety rates rising, depression, is that people resort to sort of this black or white thinking, which is a very simplified way of looking at the world. So you have this stress, someone comes along and offers you a solution, as Ditlin was saying, a solution that's simple, ignores a lot of the complexity in the world and tells you, I will fix this thing. And in that moment, there are people who will choose to just say, yes, okay, do it.
But that's the thing, Will. I mean, do people, okay, they've got grievances with the current democratic system. I get that. Everybody understands that. But to take the next leap and say, therefore, we're going to cozy up to authoritarianism. I mean, do they not look around the world nowadays? Do they not see what's happening in authoritarian countries? Therefore, I'm having trouble understanding the allure of it all. Maybe you can help me with that.
Well, I think the important thing to note is that in the UK, at least, we have not seen young people actively joining authoritarian parties, and we haven't seen a kind of big surge in authoritarianism amongst young people within the political process. But you are starting to see that within some European countries. If you look at what happened in the recent French election, I think 49% of 25 to 34-year-olds voted for Marine Le Pen, for example. You saw that in the recent Italian election, in the recent Swedish election as well. And Yasha's done a huge amount of work specifically on that trend towards authoritarianism within Europe. So he's the expert there. But I think actually, I would say first past the post contested democracies like the UK and the US, you see that much less because there's less ability for authoritarian parties to break through and kind of appeal to those grievances, particularly of young people. But that's not to say it can't happen in the future. And I think what we were trying to do with this report is sound a bit of a warning sign, sound just not to the left in this country who does win the votes of young people, but also to the right, to the Conservatives who are in power, who don't typically think about young people, particularly within the policy-making process, but really need to if they're going to avoid democracy falling into trouble in the future. And I think that's a key question. This isn't just a question for kind of progressive parties who do appeal to young people at the moment. It's also a problem for centre-right parties who believe in democracy as the best way to run a government.
Yasha, I wonder how much of this as well is rooted in the fact that when I was the age of the people we're talking about tonight, the Cold War was on, and it was pretty obvious what side you wanted to be on, and you knew you didn't want to be on the other side. We're at actually just past the 50th anniversary of the Summit Series, the Canada-Soviet hockey series that was the most incredible hockey series of all time. And you know, if you lived through that, you knew what side you wanted to be on. Do you think part of the problem today is that young people don't know history? They don't know current affairs. Is that an issue?
Yeah, and again, I think when I look at how civics is taught in many countries, there is an emphasis on the downsides of our political system, on the injustices of today. There's often an emphasis on how you can go and become politically active. And both of those things are very good. That should be a part of the civic education of our citizens or of our future citizens. But what we often don't do is to say, here are the upsides of liberal democracy. Here is the huge downsides of authoritarian systems. Here's what it looked like to live under communist regimes. Here's what it looked like to live under fascist regimes. Here's what it's like to live today in Venezuela or Russia or other places. But I want to pick up on one strand of a conversation. I think Will started to talk about this a little bit, but there was a kind of tacit assumption that perhaps all of us had in parts of a conversation that, you know, young people are much more progressive and liberal, right? That the reason why young people are frustrated is that they want really radical action on climate change and we're just not delivering enough on that and so on. And I just want to be a little bit cautious about that. So I'm looking here, for example, at a recent Gallup poll in the United States, which shows that among 18 to 29-year-olds, 34% of young people consider themselves liberal, so left-leaning, 41% consider themselves moderate, and 23% consider themselves conservative. So it's only about a third of young people who would actually consider themselves left-leaning according to this poll. And so there's sort of different reasons why different young people are going to be dissatisfied with democracy. There's going to be some left-leaning ones who say we want more radical action on climate change, we don't like people like Donald Trump being elected in office, etc. But there's also going to be conservative young people who feel very differently about what's going on in the society, which helps to explain, as Will was saying, that a lot of young people voted for Marine Le Pen in France in the last elections. And there's a lot of people in the center of politics who probably just think, you know, there's so much rancor and so much polarization and so much hatred. I don't think the system is working for me, but not necessarily because they feel that, politics is either too far to the left or too far to the right for them, but simply because they have the sense there's too much fighting, too much rancor, and not enough delivering on actual issues.
Well, Sam, I'm clearly not asking this about you because you are engaged in the issues of the day. You're, apathy is boring as your organization. You're all about trying to get young people to engage more with the democratic institutions of the country. From what I see, young people want to get involved in public life, for example. It's easy. They volunteer, they're in on the ground floor, they could end up being the chief of staff to a politician a year later. I mean, sometimes it's that easy. What do you see that maybe I'm not about how impenetrable some of our democratic institutions may be if young people want to engage with them? Is that an issue?
Definitely. And I think I just want to touch on something that was brought up before. I think one of the things with democracy that we don't tend to separate enough is democracy in and of itself is an idea about how our society is governed, but how that's operationalized is our political system. Those are the rules, right, that we all follow, and the norms and the practices and all of that. So I think when we think about how civics is taught, for example, in schools, we often focus on these very rigid procedural elements. A bill goes to the House of Commons and then it gets passed in the first reading and blah, blah, blah. And yes, that's important to know. But what we don't always talk about is sort of the norms and practices that surround that. And so it can be very intimidating to walk into a political environment if you don't understand who's really holding the levers of power, where those discussions happen. And in Canada particularly, I think a lot of our political debate is relegated into caucus environments that are closed. So we don't always see the open debate. We see question period where people might be throwing, barbs back and forth at each other, but not the same rigor, I guess.
I hear you, but do they understand that anybody can join a political party in this country, and most parties don't charge anything for doing it? You can go to conventions, you can get in on the ground floor, you can participate, you can have an impact. They don't see that?
I think they know that it's possible. I don't think they know why they would want to do it. And I think that's the interesting part. How does power get allocated in those environments? Are you taken seriously? Are you able to have a say? I think young people will put their energy because they care so deeply about issues, and I think Yasha's right, those issues are varied and there's no monolith among youth. But I really think that it's important that we remember that young people will show up and put their energy where they feel their energy is making a difference. And if they don't feel that way, then they won't. And that's why voter turnout goes up and down when it comes to young people and has been trending down for so long. I think they don't see the purpose of it. So they'll find other channels in other ways, and that's what we're talking about here today, to see their priorities addressed. And if the political system that we have currently is not addressing those issues, then they will look to other places. They will, glue themselves to the speaker's chair, or that's an expression of frustration around their ability to have an impact in our political system when we say that democracy is there to represent all of us, and some are better represented than others.
Deedlin, can I ask you about your students? I mean, you're teaching poli-sci students, so we have to assume off the top that they're interested in these kinds of issues. Do they feel that the political institutions of this country are so impenetrable right now that there's no point in engaging?
Yes, I would agree with what has been said before, that there is a doubt that political institutions will actually react to them. And there is even research showing and confirming this. So when political parties, for example, reach out and experiments explicitly make a stance for young people, they are being punished by other voters. So it is politically risky even parties to reach out to young people. There needs to be a political solution that is much more universal and that kind of cuts across party politics as we see it right now in order to address this fundamental problem. But because of that, as Samantha said, there is a reaction of young people. They don't expect political actors to react to them, so they kind of withdraw into a different world. And what we see now is also that the young people don't know all the details about living in an authoritarian society, but they also don't know all the aspects of what makes a democracy work. And so, for example, when we ask democratic knowledge questions, not procedural ones, but just kind of, what is this situation democratic or not? How do you feel about it? Younger people are much less likely to judge or evaluate the situation correctly as either democratic or undemocratic. So the lack of democratic knowledge even is also very blatant. And so we see even kind of an interesting conundrum that people, for example, who think that democracy is important also support a very strong leader who can do away with elections and so on. So we feel actually that there is a lack of knowledge of the details of the democratic process and how young people can really engage.
Yasha, is it worse in America because the country is so much more polarized than we are in Canada?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in Canada, you have a political system that Canadians like to complain about for good reason. Everybody complains about their own political system. But I do think that there is a sense that there are 2 or 3 sane choices at each election, that elections have consequences. Sometimes there's a change of government, and then that new government can actually pursue different policies. And then at the next election, voters get a chance to say, hey, did the government do a good job, or did I actually not like it very much? And perhaps I'll go back to voting for the other set of parties that are currently in opposition. In the United States, there is both a sense that the polarization is extreme, that often very motivated activist bases control the political parties, so that many people feel that they don't particularly like either political party. And then when a party does win a presidential election, for example, there are so many veto powers, so many roadblocks to actually passing reform and legislation that it doesn't seem to have very much impact on the kinds of policies that the government pursues and the kind of laws that are on the book. And so that mixture between stasis and anger, that mixture between nothing really changes, nothing really happens, but people are shouting all of the time, and these people I really dislike are on the television every day and they're in power, that's a really unhealthy mix. And I think it does create a deeper cynicism about democracy among young people in the United States, but also among older people in the United States.
Well, okay, but Will, how much of this is just out and out complacency? They assume democracy's been here yesterday, it's here today, it'll be here tomorrow, and they don't feel they really need to engage or participate in order to ensure its continuation.
I think the interesting question is the extent to which this is actually cultural and part of a much broader trend amongst young people. So in our study that you cited, Steve, we looked at trends of things like volunteering and civic participation amongst young people, and we know that across many generations or many years, young people have become less and less likely to do those things. And if you look back through the history of democracy, people like de Tocqueville and others called civic participation, civic association, the mother science of democracy. That was the thing that kept it working. People participating in broader civic society. They might be a member of a trade union, they might be a member of a friendly society back in the day. And a lot of that kind of infrastructure and association has fallen away. And young people today are increasingly isolated. They're much less likely to have close friends. They're much less likely to participate in some of those groups. They're much less likely to volunteer in their community. And I do think that that has quite a profound impact on democracy. That kind of undermines some of that cultural support for collective bargaining, as Yasha was talking about earlier. And so I'm not sure it is complacency. I think it's a broader cultural shift. And the interesting thing about that is if that is true, then those things are possible to reverse. It is possible to engage young people in volunteering and civic participation. It is possible to introduce new forms of civic service on a national scale, as you have in some countries. And so I do think that there is an interesting policy question, but I'm not sure it's complacency. I think it's a broader cultural shift.
Well, you've nicely led us to where we need to go next, which is, okay, if we want to get more young people engaged and get them turned on to democracy, Dietland, let's have some ideas. What do we need to do?
Well, I think one idea would be to have more direct contacts to people who live in authoritarian societies and to have them tell our young people what kind of the limitations and constraints are and what kind of sacrifices people make living in such societies, and therefore exchange about the potential values of a democratic system. I think today that we don't have the kind of divisions of the Cold War where we get more direct information about the other side of the wall, so to say. We need this kind of input of these societies. So that could be arranged civics lessons in schools and organizations and so on. I mean, that would be one idea. The other would be to make civic lessons much more interesting and hands-on, to actually have young people be responsible for a certain part of a city's budget, for example, and to be able to decide together what to do with this budget according to their wishes, so they can follow through with their democratic ideas and their conversations, their dialogue with the other side, and so on. So to have a hands-on civics lessons is much more important than the actual procedural aspects of a democracy that you learn more theoretically.
I love these ideas. Let's keep going. Sam, what else?
I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done at the local level. I know we've all seen sort of the stats around the voter turnout in the municipal elections that just happened in BC, and obviously there are municipal elections happening on Monday here in Ontario. And I think that there's a big loss that's happening at that level where, one, we don't seem to have the same kind of media coverage locally, especially in smaller communities. So people don't really know what's happening in their city halls. But there's so much work that can be done at that level to build trust. Young people tend to trust municipal governments more so than other levels of government. And there's work that can be done there, to the point around volunteering, creating local networks where people can have dialogue around things happening in their community, discuss solutions, and then building power at that level, I think, is one way that's appealing to young people, particularly around issues that they do care about, and also can allow them to have a bit more of that feedback loop around actually making an impact, because it's so much easier to sort of set up around these nested goals and incrementally work towards change than expecting to go from zero to eradicating climate change, for example. And really doing that experiential learning and community learning and mentorship, I think, from what we've seen in our programs, gives people so much more confidence in their ability to have an impact at all, but also gives a sense of belonging and breaks down some of the social isolation that we haven't even really touched on, but is impacting so many young people, particularly after the pandemic, where we do see this this loss of connection with the people who live around us. And that lack of sense of belonging is also leading people into spaces where they do find that belonging. But the narratives that come along with that, the worldviews that come along with that, and in some cases, the shared outright lies about our broader society that come with that is the trade-off that we're seeing for some young people.
Yasha Monk, what else?
Well, I think we have a lot of great ideas on the table. I think Sam is absolutely right about the need for concrete ways to get engaged locally. I think Will is right about the need for a form of national service where people can choose to spend a year or 6 months or perhaps 2 years really engaging in communities. I think Rosalind made important points about the need for more and better civics lessons and for us to really communicate what it's like to live in authoritarian systems. By the way, one of the things I've been struck by is how little coverage there's been in Western media of these incredibly courageous protests in Iran. I don't understand why this incredible, inspiring, important story is hardly being talked about. That is important in itself, and it also would be an important moment for people to learn about that. But I want to say something slightly paradoxical, which is that I fear that when politicians and institutions and so on say, hey, we worry about how unengaged young people are, we should give them more of a voice, we should listen to them more, what we often do is a mistake, which is they then assume that those young people who are really engaged in a political process, who are really activists, speak for the rest of their generation. But nearly by definition, that is not the case, because they're actually part of the minority of young people who are super engaged in the political system, and often their views are systematically different from others. So paradoxically, we need to create more space for young people to engage in the political system, but we should also be aware of thinking, hey, those people who are engaging, who are really activists, are actually representative of public opinion among young people more broadly.
Okay, we got a minute and change to go here. Will, I want to give it to you. Because, well, look, as you get older, you kind of turn on to some ideas that when you were a kid, you might have thought were a bit crazy. You start to like jazz. You start to like classical music. Is it possible that as these 18 to 30-year-olds get older, they'll just kind of turn on to democracy by virtue of getting older?
So it is possible, but what we know from all of the data is that they are becoming more democratic more slowly, perhaps, than other generations before them, and that if you look at different points in time, younger generations are significantly more likely to be anti-democratic than previous generations at the age at which they are. So this does seem to be a cohort effect rather than an age effect, to use the technical terminology, i.e. these cohorts are structurally more likely to be anti-democratic, and that is unlikely to change dramatically as they age. But just in terms of what we can do about it, just very quickly, I very strongly agree with Yasha around the idea of national civic service. But just to pick up on one thing that Sam said, I think local journalism is crucial here, and much better journalism to reach young people. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts that we've seen over the last few decades as social media and kind of internet journalism has taken hold. That kind of authoritative local journalism and that local democratic voice has been lost. And I think that is one of the biggest problems in many Western democracies, and it's common across all of these countries that we've talked about tonight.
Some wonderful, wonderful ideas here. I want to thank the four of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views. Will Tanner, Yasha Monk, Dietlin Stoll, Samantha Roosh. Would you say hi to your dad for me, please, Samantha, who's one of the great hockey play-by-play guys, Ron Roosh, Canada Cups, Olympic Games, National Hockey League. Anyway, I was a big fan of his back in the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, very much. There's a version of the future where self-driving electric cars ferry people around in an emission-free but car-friendly world. Paris Marx is not buying it for a minute. Why not? Well, that's laid out in their new book. It's called Road to Nowhere: What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. Paris Marx hosts the podcast Tech Won't Save Us and joins us now here in our studio. Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too.
Great to have you here. I want to start by just reading an excerpt of the book, and then we'll dive in. The history of automobility is hardly a natural progression. Its present-day dominance of transportation systems in North America, Australia, parts of Europe, and increasingly in parts of the global south is the product of a concerted effort by invested interests to completely overhaul the way we live and get around to serve their bottom lines. Instead of living within close proximity of our workplaces and the services we rely on, Everything has been spread out so that we have to buy an automobile, insure it, get frequent maintenance, fill it up with fuel, and waste a growing amount of our time in traffic. There were opportunities to take a different path, but powerful interests won out and got the support of the state to subsidize and entrench their vision for the future. That's a very different take on things, as you well know. What's wrong with the notion that we have a transportation system that was developed ostensibly by capitalism, by the profit motive?
Well, I think it ends up serving a certain array of interests over what we actually need to get around, right? It doesn't best serve the communities, doesn't look to, ensure that we get around in an efficient way, in an affordable way. It's how can we encourage people to spend more and more of their money on transportation, and then that benefits a whole load of different interests, whether it's auto companies or oil companies or various other interests that are associated with it.
Now, you live in Newfoundland.
Absolutely.
Has it been different in Canada, our experience? Is it different than that which you've just described?
No, I think it's quite similar, actually. Certainly we can look to the United States as somewhere where the automobile is maybe most entrenched, but very much that has, carried over to Canada. We've made major investments in order to encourage people to use automobiles. Certainly when we look at, the percentage of trips that people take using cars, it's really high because we have built our communities in such a way that for many people, you need a car just to get around.
Had it not unfolded the way it has, in other words, if we could go back and redesign it in a way that you think is more commodious to other interests, how would we have done things differently?
I think we wouldn't have put so much effort into encouraging people to drive, right? Because there was an opportunity to, sure, you have cars in there, but you also have many other different ways of getting around that work for people in their cities, right, that are convenient. But in many of the communities that we ended up building, as we built out the suburbs and expanded the size of cities, those communities were not built in such a way where it's easy to cycle to get where you're going to go or easy to take transit. It's built in such a way that you basically need to drive or you're going to be really inconvenienced when you need to get around.
The suggestion, though, seems to be that it was those sort of evil forces that foisted this system upon us, as opposed to our having chosen to do it this way, because a lot of people like living in the suburbs and they like the wider roads and they like the freedom that driving a car brings, etc. You don't buy that?
I think it's a mix, right? I think that there were definitely reasons to adopt that early on when it was being sold to people, right? And when you think of, visions of the future as they're often sold to people, when you think back to the early promise of the automobile, the amount of time you were going to spend stuck in traffic wasn't part of the promise. The amount of time you were going to have to spend on an automobile wasn't part of the promise. There were a whole load of things that weren't really part of the contract that was given to people for what this future, what this suburban future was going to look like. And I think now, a number of decades on, we can look back at that and say, okay, there were things that maybe made sense about what we were doing in that moment, but I think that we took it much too far. I think that we allowed the automobile to take over far too much, and that it's time for us to maybe reassess that past and think about what we're going to do in the future to rectify some of those problems that we've created.
And we shall get to that, but before we go there, why do you think it's important for people to understand the history of our cities and highways and why it sort of came to be this way?
Yeah, I think it can be easy to think, when we think about our cities right now, that this is the way it is, this is the way it's always been, this is the way it's always going to be, right? But going back and looking at that history shows us that it used to be very different, right? Our streets were not always kind of exclusive roadways for cars. Sure, there are some buses on there, streetcars, things like that, but largely the street is the space for the car. At one time, it was a much more kind of shared space for many different forms of transportation where people could walk, could bike, and because of the low speeds, this was navigated between a whole load of different people. And when the car really rolled out, we forget now that there was a lot of backlash to that by people who lived in cities who are experiencing the very direct downsides of that as people were dying, children in particular, and there were a lot of protests against it. And so I think that, understanding how the car came to be gives us more insight into, how we got to where we are today, and also kind of denaturalizes this system that we have right now and allows us to question, what we've built and also where it can go next.
I do remember seeing very old pictures of this city, though, before the car took over, and you've essentially got, you got dirt streets, right? You get dirt streets, no streetcars, very little vehicular traffic. I mean, you're not saying we can go back to that.
No, absolutely not. I'm not saying it was perfect and we need to look back to better days or anything. Just to say that the streets operated in a different way at one time. They can still operate in a different way again if we want to rethink how we distribute space on the street, what forms of transportation we give priority to. Right now, a lot of priority is given to the car. And the question is, should we give more of that space over to cyclists or to bus lanes or things like that to encourage people to get around in a different way and to make it easier for people not to have to take a car to get around the city?
Part of the contract we have apparently made with the car involves, as you just indicated, a lot of death. And I want to just put some numbers here on the table that you talk about in your book. You have written, in the United States alone, 3.7 million people have been killed by motor vehicles since 1899. That's basically, I looked it up, that's Croatia, the country of Croatia, that's their population. In the year 2020, almost 40,000 Americans died in car accidents. And we shouldn't even call them accidents, because they're not accidents. A lot of people think we're dying by design. And yet, there are no demonstrations in the streets about the unsafety of our streets, our design, our failure to share the road appropriately. It seems to be a fact of life that we accept this much carnage on the roads. Why do you think?
I think it's quite troubling, right? I think it's quite troubling that it's been normalized to that degree, and certainly the death figures aren't as bad in Canada as they are in the United States, where it's particularly bad. But I think it's worrying that we've just kind of accepted that this is the trade-off for having all these cars around, that people are naturally going to die when it doesn't have to be this way, right? When we can make different decisions, whether it is, just to change the way that automobility works, that our streets work right now to reduce the number of deaths that automobiles are causing, or to move away from having so many people dependent on automobiles altogether, right? There are actions that we can take today in order to reduce those deaths, but there's not the priority on it that I think there should be. And I think that there are some movements, some groups that are trying to call more attention to this, that are trying to force this to be more of a topic of conversation. Certainly there's the growth of, say, Vision Zero movements and things like that that are trying to have those policies adopted to reduce those death numbers. But it's seriously concerning that this is a trade-off that we've made. And to relate it to something today, I think that we're also seeing a normalization with COVID and things like that, right? As these deaths continue, it's just something that we need to accept as part of living in society. And I think the question is, do we really need to accept that, or could we be doing things, whether it's to reduce road deaths, to reduce COVID deaths, that we've just decided we kind of collectively don't want to do?
Well, we seem to be going in the opposite way that you would like us to go, because I look at the 400 series highways in this province, the 401, the 400, and so on. They've increased the speed limits to 110 kilometers an hour. And my hunch is that if anybody ran for office on a pledge to reduce the speed limit in the city of Toronto, for example, or in Ottawa, to 30 kilometers an hour, as opposed to 50, drivers would rise up in arms. They'd be furious about it. No one could get elected on that platform. Doesn't this prove people love their cars? They love their freedom. They're prepared to put up with a lot of crap in order to have the freedom to drive.
It's a good question, and I think I would see it a little bit differently, right? I think I would see it that we've built a society where the majority of people are dependent on cars to get around, and so naturally anything that now kind of restricts them in their ability to do that as they perceive the quickest way as possible, they would be opposed to it. And I think you can completely understand that, even if, when you look at the traffic science behind that, you might say, increasing the speed limits to 110 isn't really going to allow people to get where they're going quicker for the most part. You're probably going to want to better control that, and that would lead to the system being more efficient and the traffic being more efficient. It's like, when there are proposals from time to time to add roads to highways or build new highways, there's plenty of traffic science that shows that that's probably not going to reduce traffic in the long term. People are still going to get stuck in traffic, but we keep doing it because there's an assumption that, people naturally assume that if you're going to add more highway space, you're going to be able to get there quicker. But actually, we have decades of experience that shows us that's not really how it works.
Well, we just had an election in the province of Ontario back in June where the party that won pledged to build a new 400 series highway just about an hour north of here, and they won.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Yeah.
Let's do another quote from the book here.
Sure.
Sheldon, you want to bring this one up here? This is on the commercialization of the internet. We can observe the impact that the dominant interests of the 20th century have had on our lives, our communities, and the planet, and there is a lot that is not to like. However, the 21st century has a new set of powerful interests born out of the commercialization of the internet. And after amassing great fortunes of their own, they too want to make us dependent on their products, not just when we browse the web, but when we are out in our communities too. Despite promises that their visions for transportation and the city will serve everyone, it is already becoming clear that those claims are nothing more than marketing material meant to build public support for their products that will ultimately serve their companies, their shareholders, and themselves. So you are making, obviously, a corollary here between what we've been talking about and now with the internet. And let's talk about Tesla, which everybody thinks is a fabulously innovative company and is doing things in a completely new and revolutionary way. You don't think so? Why not?
No, not exactly. I think Tesla's a really interesting example, right? I think it's been kind of positioned as the company that is leading us into the future of kind of the electric vehicle, right? I think it has certainly made some advances because of the people who were there before Elon Musk, and certainly the people who he depends on to actually do the work while he kind of, does the marketing, right? But I think that we were already kind of heading in a direction toward electric mobility anyway. There were car companies already working on it just before Tesla. Tesla certainly plays a role in making it more appealing to some people, but I think it's a direction we were going on anyway. And Tesla has also been pushing the notion that autonomous vehicles are right around the corner since about 2014, and they're still not here, and I don't think they're going to be here for a while yet.
There's still, there's a lot of testing going on still.
Absolutely.
And a lot of hope that that may be the way to go. You're not sold?
No. I think that the past 8 years of talk around autonomous vehicles has really served to distract us from the conversations that we should be having about transportation in our cities, right? The autonomous vehicle promised that it was going to reduce traffic, make transportation more accessible to people who are underserved by the system right now, eliminate road deaths. Meanwhile, as you were saying, road deaths are increasing in the United States. More and more people are stuck in traffic for longer. The autonomous vehicle is nowhere to be seen in any kind of mass sense. It's just being tested. Meanwhile, we could have been taking actions for those 8 years to try to remedy some of those problems, actions that we don't need new technology for.
What do you find particularly problematic about Uber from a technology innovation standpoint?
Many things. We could talk for a long time about Uber. I think at the core, though, Uber really emerges out of the recession period, right? Really takes advantage of a lot of precarious labor that existed as a result, people who had lost their jobs during the recession, and really promised that by using these technologies in a way to upend the taxi system, we were going to make transportation a lot more efficient in cities. And what independent researchers have found is that basically all the promises that they made about the improvements they were going to deliver were not followed through on, and they actually made traffic worse in cities. They didn't really serve the underserved. They didn't reduce car ownership. They took people away from transit, so it's making those trips more inefficient, sorry. And then, the core of that as well is Uber has spent a lot of time lobbying against the rights of its drivers to ensure that they're carved out of employment protections, treated as independent contractors. And that's not only a problem for those drivers and the people who are in the gig economy, but also if they're successful in entrenching that, presents the threat of more companies, reclassifying their workers in that way to carve them out of the protections that they should have.
You ever take Uber?
I've been in an Uber one time.
And?
It was like a taxi, basically. A friend called it when it arrived. I didn't know about it, but when it was there, I said, well, it'd be mean to the guy to not take it, so we just made sure we tipped him well. Yeah.
Like a taxi, except you could order it on your phone, and I know you can for some taxis now.
Yeah.
But when it emerged, you can order it on your phone. Probably a nicer car.
Yeah.
And probably cheaper. You don't think that's an innovation?
Not really. Certainly moving to being able to hail it on your phone, that's, something new. As you say, a lot of taxi companies have adopted it. It's not a real kind of transformation of the taxi industry. The key there, though, is the cost, right? The promise was that this is going to be cheaper, it's going to be more efficient than the taxi system that exists right now. a big part of the reason that Uber was cheaper than the taxi industry is that it lost billions of dollars a year in order to finance its growth, and it still loses money to this day. It's not a profitable company. And so it benefited from losing all that money because investors kept giving it money to lose, because we were in an era where money was cheap, it was easy to access that capital, but also it was able to take advantage of the fact that, you know, its workers had fewer rights and fewer protections, and it was able to pay them less and push down their wages. And so I don't think that's really an innovation we should be, you know, looking to
trumpeting, right.
Exactly.
And I guess I should say, I mean, it can be cheaper. You know, if you take it in off-peak hours, if you share a ride with somebody else, it can be cheaper. Otherwise, it can be just as expensive as a taxi.
Absolutely. But then the other piece of that as well, as you said with the vehicles, is that, you know, everyone has to own their own vehicle. You don't have this fleet that you're managing. And so there are experts who, you know, I've read their work, and they suggest that the Uber model is actually less efficient because you don't have the fleet to manage, but you also have these really expensive headquarters, you know, the tech engineers that are paid a lot of money, instead of the kind of lower cost taxi model that actually has some efficiencies in there that are important.
Well, you've made the case in this that you think we ought to do things differently.
Yeah.
Okay, such as, what would you like to see happen?
So, as we were talking about, I think that we need to see less of a focus on the automobile, right? Especially in this moment where we recognize that there needs to be a change in the way that people get around, both for, you know, the reasons as we talked about, the deaths that are happening, the amount of time people are stuck in traffic, but also when we recognize, you know, the contribution of transportation to climate change. There is a moment here where we need to decide what the future of our transportation system is going to look like. And so there's one direction where we make a lot of investments in electric cars, but we still have people largely stuck in their cars as they are today. Or we put a lot more focus in investing in transit infrastructure to expand that, to make it more reliable, more affordable for people. We expand cycling infrastructure so that we ensure that people can safely get where they need to go. They can store their bikes and know it won't get stolen. We make communities where you can actually access more of the things that you need, you know, in proximity to where you live, so you don't need to actually travel as far to reach these things. And we have better transportation between our cities as well, whether it's better rail networks, high-speed rail, you know, from Windsor to Quebec City, for example.
Which they've only been talking about for half a century.
Exactly, exactly. So there are things that we can do today to make these changes, to try to encourage people and to make it easy for people to get around in a different way. As I said, you know, going back to the history in the book, you know, I really explored how there were a lot of investments, a lot of regulatory changes, a lot of tax measures put in to encourage people to move to the suburbs, to build the suburbs even, to adopt cars. And I think that we need to look at that infrastructure that we've put in place, that set of laws and regulations, and see if we need to start, you know, rearranging those to encourage a different way of living, a different way of getting around.
Well, I think we got somewhere with that conversation. In contrary to the title of the book, which is The Road to Nowhere. What Silicon Valley gets wrong about the future of transportation. It's brought Paris Marks to our studio, and we are delighted to have you here. Thanks so much.
I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
The difference between, you know, influencers, you know, pushing perfume or clothing, it's not quite the same as financial services where people can really get hurt. I think if I'm a finfluencer, what I would be concerned about is credibility and liability.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.